It's just past midnight, a quiet night in southwest Minnesota. The town of Marshall sleeps under a cold, starless sky. The highways are empty, the fields stretch endlessly in every direction, and the only sounds are the whisper of wind and the hum of a car moving down a lonely road. Somewhere on that road, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson is driving home. He's just finished celebrating the end of his college semester, laughing with friends, full of plans for summer. He drives carefully, headlights cutting through the darkness. Out here, there are no streetlights, only gravel roads that twist between open fields. He's confident he knows the way. But tonight, the familiar turns unfamiliar. The car jolts suddenly, slides and dips forward. The front tires sink into a ditch. Brandon exhales sharply. The wheels spin, the engine hums, but the car doesn't move. He tries again. Nothing. It's late, but he's calm. He reaches for his phone and dials home. The call connects. His mother answers, sleepy but alert. "Mom, I'm fine," he says, "but I went off the road. Can you and Dad come get me?" She wakes his father, and both begin to dress quickly, asking questions. "Where are you, Brandon?" his father asks. Brandon replies, "I'm near Lynd. I can see the lights. It's not far." They tell him to stay where he is, but he insists, "I'll walk toward town. It's close." His parents agree to meet him halfway. They stay on the phone, guiding each other. He describes the road, the fences, the distant lights. His voice is steady, confident. His parents drive through the dark, headlights sweeping across fields, searching. But as the minutes pass, things don't add up. The turns he describes don't match where they are. The signs don't exist. The landmarks don't line up. It's as if they're in two different places. 15 minutes pass. 20. The line stays open. His parents call out for him, hoping to see his headlights, but there is nothing. Brandon laughs softly once or twice, trying to ease the tension. "I'll meet you halfway," he says. His mother replies, "Brandon, stop walking, please. Stay where you are." He keeps moving. "It's okay, Mom. I can see the lights. I'm close." The sound of gravel crunches under his shoes. The wind hums faintly through the phone. His parents keep driving, turning down every road he mentions. Still, nothing. The clock passes 2:30 a.m. 40 minutes now. They're on the phone the entire time, connected by a signal, a voice, and hope. Then suddenly, there's a pause. His footsteps slow. The sound fades. His father starts to speak, but Brandon cuts in, his tone sharp, startled. "Oh." The line goes silent. No sound, no static, just silence. His parents freeze. They redial immediately. The call rings, but no answer. Again. Again. Still nothing. They drive faster, hearts pounding, scanning every road, every ditch, every fence. But he's gone. The night gives them nothing. 47 minutes. That's how long the call lasted. 47 minutes between safety and silence. One moment, their son was right there, guiding them through the dark. The next, he was gone. No scream, no crash, no struggle. Just a voice, cut off mid-sentence. And from that moment began one of Minnesota's most haunting mysteries. How does someone vanish in a place so open, so ordinary, so close to home? Tonight, we follow every word of that call, every step of that walk, and every unanswered question left behind in the cold night air. This is the disappearance of Brandon Swanson.
Morning light breaks over the flat Minnesota landscape, slow and pale, spreading across fields still wet from the night dew. The Swanson family's house stands quiet, except for the sound of phones ringing and footsteps pacing the floor. They haven't slept, not even for a moment, because somewhere out there, their son is missing. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old, a college student, a friend, a son, and a dreamer. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't wild, He was the kind of young man every parent feels safe trusting. He studied wind energy at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, a field that fascinated him. He wanted to build something that mattered, something good for the world. He had just finished his spring semester and was excited about what came next. A simple summer at home, a few trips with friends, maybe a part-time job. Ordinary plans for an ordinary boy living an ordinary life. He grew up in Marshall, Minnesota, a small town surrounded by open land, farms, and gravel roads that all seemed to lead to the same place. Everyone knew everyone here. Brandon was friendly, polite, a bit quiet at first, but once you knew him, he never stopped talking. His friends called him loyal, funny, and stubborn in the best way. He'd never hesitate to help someone out, even if it meant being late for himself. He wasn't the type to disappear. He wasn't the type to run away. That's what makes this story so hard to understand. How does a 19-year-old boy who grew up on these very roads suddenly vanish between two towns he's driven through his entire life? The day before his disappearance had been normal. He attended his last class of the semester, said goodbye to classmates, and later that night drove to Lynd, a short 15-minute drive, to hang out with some friends and celebrate. They played games, listened to music, talked about summer, nothing out of the ordinary. Around midnight, he decided to head home. His friends watched him walk out to his car, wave goodbye, and drive off into the dark. At that moment, nothing seemed unusual. No fear, no worry, just another quiet night in Minnesota. But those roads between Lynd and Marshall can be confusing at night. Long stretches of dirt, open farmland, no signs, no lights. Miss one turn and you can end up miles from where you thought you were. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe one wrong turn started a chain of moments that couldn't be undone. His parents, Annette and Brian, described him as strong-minded, determined, the kind of boy who'd say, "I can handle it," even when things got tough. That's likely why, when his car got stuck, he didn't panic. He just called home, calmly, rationally, believing his parents would find him soon, believing nothing bad could happen on roads he'd known all his life. But that calmness is what makes the story even chilling, because you can almost hear it, can't you? The sound of his voice on that phone call, calm, confident, talking about fences, gravel, and the faint glow of distant lights. He believed he was safe. He believed he'd be home soon. His friends later said Brandon had a big heart and a curious mind. He liked old rock music, long drives, and nights spent just sitting under the stars talking about the future. He wasn't a risk-taker, not a thrill-seeker. He was careful, thoughtful, and he loved his family deeply. That's why the moment his phone went silent, it didn't feel real. It felt impossible. His parents replayed that moment again and again. Every word of that 47-minute call etched into their memories. They knew his voice. They knew when he was calm, and they knew when he wasn't. And at the end of that call, in that final second, his tone changed. It was quick, startled, like he saw something he didn't expect. And then, nothing. By sunrise, the fear had settled in. Calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. His car still hadn't been found, and deep down, his parents knew something was terribly wrong. But who was Brandon Swanson? He was someone who believed the world was good, who believed problems could be solved with patience, and help was always coming. He wasn't a stranger to anyone in Marshall. He was the kind of person people remembered for his laugh, his honesty, his kindness. And now, he was gone. In a world full of cameras, cell towers, and endless data, it seems impossible that someone could vanish completely. But Brandon Swanson did. His story reminds us of how fragile that line is, between safety and danger, between ordinary life and the unexplainable. The Swanson family had no idea yet, but the search for Brandon was about to begin. A search that would stretch across miles of farmland, rivers, and roads and lead to more questions than answers. Because when someone like Brandon disappears, it isn't just a mystery. It's a wound that never truly heals. And for the Swansons, the nightmare was only beginning.
The night of May 13th, 2008 had started quietly. No storms, no traffic, nothing unusual in the air. For Brandon Swanson, it was just another night, a drive home after spending time with friends. He left Lynd a little after midnight, took what he believed was the right road back toward Marshall, and disappeared into the dark. At 1:54 a.m., his phone call to his parents began, a call that would last exactly 47 minutes. On the other end, his mother and father got into their car, still half asleep but alert, ready to bring their son home. They thought it would be simple: find the ditch, help him out, go back to bed. But the world had other plans. Brandon said he was near Lynd. He could see the lights of town. He sounded calm, clear, certain. He told them his car was stuck in a ditch, but he wasn't hurt. He said he'd been on a gravel road. Nothing seemed alarming. His parents drove toward Lynd, talking to him the whole time. But soon, something strange began to happen. They couldn't find him. The roads they took didn't match the ones he described. The turns he mentioned didn't exist. He'd say things like, "I'm by a field," or "I passed a fence," but out there, every road looked like that. Miles of farmland, dirt, and nothingness. No landmarks. No sign of where he really was. They kept driving, headlights cutting through the night, but they saw no other car. No lights, no movement. Just empty roads and silence. His mother asked if he could see their headlights. He said no. His father told him to flash his lights. He said, "I can't. I'm walking now." He had decided to leave the car, believing he could meet them halfway. He said he could see town lights in the distance. He thought it would be faster. His parents told him to stay put, but he insisted, "I'll meet you halfway." As he walked, his voice faded and returned, sometimes loud, sometimes soft. The sound of his shoes crunching on gravel filled the spaces between their words. Every few minutes, they'd ask where he was. He'd say, "I'm still walking toward the lights." But the more he walked, the farther he seemed to get. At one point, he told them he was near a creek or a fence line. His father said they'd checked that area, but nothing looked familiar. The confusion grew. They were both looking for each other, both sure they were close, but somehow they were miles apart. The air grew colder, the roads darker. The call continued minute after minute. They tried not to sound worried. He tried not to sound tired, but his voice had started to change. Slower, quieter. His mother kept saying, "We're close, honey, just keep talking." And he did. He described passing through fields, stepping over fences, following what he thought was a road. But the terrain out there can trick you. One wrong step and you're off a trail, walking into open farmland that stretches endlessly in every direction. There are no houses, no landmarks, no sound but the wind. The conversation never broke into panic. That's what made it strange. It stayed calm. Until the very end. At 2:41 a.m., the call had been going for 47 minutes. His father remembers hearing him laugh once, softly. He said something like, "Almost there." Then the sound of footsteps slowed. His breathing changed. And then suddenly, a short sound. Sharp. Surprised. He said, "Oh, The line went dead. No noise after that. No static. Just silence. His parents tried to call back immediately. The phone rang, but he didn't answer. They called again. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. The sound of a ringing phone in the dark. That was all that was left. They drove every road they could find, yelling his name out the windows, hoping he'd hear them. But the night swallowed their voices. No headlights in the distance, no signal, just the sound of their car engine
and the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. They called friends, they called neighbors, and when the sun began to rise, they called the police. At first, the officers didn't react urgently. Brandon was 19, legally an adult. Maybe he'd gone to a friend's house, maybe he'd turned off his phone. But Annette and Brian knew their son. This wasn't normal. This wasn't him. By 6:30 a.m., the police began searching. The first thing they found was his car, still stuck in a ditch. The engine was off, the door was closed, the keys were gone. But here's the thing. The car wasn't anywhere near Lynd. It was near Taunton, almost 25 miles away from where he said he was. That meant for the entire 47-minute phone call, Brandon had no idea where he actually was. The lights he saw weren't Lynd. They were another town altogether. When his parents learned that, everything changed. It meant that every word, every step, every direction that night had been leading them the wrong way. But even after finding the car, there was no sign of Brandon. No footprints leading away. No phone. No jacket. Nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police brought in dogs, and for a short distance they followed a scent trail. It led toward a nearby field, crossed over fences, and stopped near a riverbank, the Yellow Medicine River. But beyond that point, the trail ended. Maybe he fell in, they thought. Maybe he tried to cross. But the river wasn't deep, not at that time of year. Searchers waded through it, shoulder to shoulder. Nothing. So where did Brandon Swanson go? Somewhere between his car and that river, he disappeared. No evidence of foul play, no proof of an accident, just silence. And the haunting question, what happened after the line went dead?
Morning came quietly over the farmlands of western Minnesota, but inside the Swanson home, the silence was heavy. The first rays of sunlight fell across an empty driveway, an untouched breakfast table, and two parents whose lives had changed overnight. Annette sat by the phone, redialing again and again, praying to hear her son's voice. Brian paced near the window, his hands trembling, scanning the horizon like he might somehow see him walking up the road. But there was nothing, only the morning light and the sound of a phone that never answered. By 6:30 a.m., the Lyon County Sheriff's Office had joined the search. A deputy drove out to the area where Brandon's car was last pinged based on his cell phone tower data. The coordinates led them west, far beyond where the Swansons had searched the night before. It was a lonely stretch of gravel road, surrounded by farmland and ditches on both sides. And there, just as he said, they found the car. It was a small Chevy Lumina. The front wheels were stuck deep in a muddy ditch, angled slightly, as if it had slid in softly, not crashed. There were no skid marks, no signs of damage. The doors were shut, the keys were missing, the car was locked. To anyone passing by, it looked like a car someone might have simply abandoned. But to the Swansons, it was proof. He'd been here. He was real. His voice last night wasn't a dream. Brian and Annette arrived at the scene minutes later. They looked around, flat land in every direction. Empty fields, small groves of trees, a nearby stream, nothing else. Brian called out his son's name. The wind carried the sound away. No response. The deputies started a basic ground search. They walked through fields, checked fence lines, followed dirt paths. They called his name. They listened. Nothing. Then they brought in tracking dogs. The dogs picked up a scent near the car, followed it across a field, down a gravel path, over a barbed wire fence. They followed it nearly 3 miles until they reached the edge of the Yellow Medicine River. There, the dogs stopped. It made sense. Brandon had mentioned walking near water that night. Maybe he tried to cross. Maybe he slipped. But when the divers arrived and search teams combed the river, they found nothing. No clothes, no wallet, no phone, no trace. For days, volunteers joined the search. Farmers, students, neighbors.
Some came with ATVs, others on foot. Helicopters flew overhead. Every ditch, every creek, every grove of trees was checked, but there was nothing to find. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. For the Swansons, life became divided before that night and after. They still kept his room, his clothes, his photos. They talked about him in the present tense, as if he might walk in any moment. And in their hearts, they held on to one small piece of hope, that maybe, somehow, he had survived. But deep down, they knew something happened out there that night. Something they still couldn't explain. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the story of Brandon Swanson spread across Minnesota. Local news stations picked it up. People online debated theories, shared maps, tried to trace his last steps. Everyone had an idea, but no one had an answer. Because in a town where nothing ever goes wrong, one quiet night had left behind a mystery that refused to fade. And for the people of Marshall, the question was no longer where Brandon went, but how someone could disappear so completely in a place where there was nowhere to hide.
As the weeks turned into months, and the fields turned from green to gold, the search for Brandon Swanson began shifting from finding a person to finding answers. Every path had been walked, every creek searched, every theory discussed in whispers that never seemed to end. Yet still, there was nothing, not a single trace of him. It was as if the earth itself had decided to keep its secret. Investigators went back to the beginning, to the 47-minute phone call. That was the last known connection between Brandon and the world. They studied phone records, tower data, coordinates, everything they could find. The call had pinged off a tower near Minnesota, not Lynd. That meant he was far northwest of where he believed he was. Somehow he'd gotten lost in one of the flattest, simplest landscapes in America, a place where every road looks the same and every light in the distance could belong to any small town. The area between Taunton and Porter became the focus. Police, volunteers, and dive teams searched again and again, but the land gave no clues. No phone, no backpack, no clothes. Even the river, which was the most likely danger, revealed nothing. And as time passed, people began to wonder, maybe Brandon never reached the river at all. The first theory was simple. He'd fallen into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. Maybe he'd tried to cross it in the dark, slipped, and the current carried him away. But the river was shallow that night, barely waist-deep in most places. Searchers had waded through it many times. They found nothing, not even a shoe. The second theory suggested something darker. Some believed he might have encountered someone that night, a passing driver, a stranger, maybe even someone he knew. But there was no evidence of another vehicle, no footprints besides his own, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest foul play. Others thought he might have walked further than anyone expected. Maybe he collapsed from exhaustion or hypothermia. The temperature had dropped close to freezing that night. But if that were true, something should have turned up. A jacket, bones, anything. And yet after hundreds of searches, the fields remained silent. There was one more strange detail. Brandon's phone. It had stayed active for several hours after the call ended. It continued to ring when his parents called back, but the signal never moved. It stayed in the same area until it finally went dead. It meant the phone had likely powered off, not lost service. But who turned it off? And why? The unanswered questions multiplied. How could a person vanish in such an open space? How could no one see anything, hear anything, or find anything? Each year, as the seasons changed, volunteers returned to the same area, searching again, hoping the ground would finally reveal what it had kept hidden. But the result was always the same. Nothing. People online started following the case. Forums, blogs, and social media filled with maps and theories. Some pointed out how disorienting those rural roads could be at night. Others believed Brandon might have walked in circles,
thinking he was heading toward town, but instead moving deeper into farmland. There were those who speculated about hidden wells, old drainage pits, even abandoned grain bins, places where someone could fall and never be found. But with each theory came more frustration, because none of them explained everything. The phone data, the missing evidence, the clean car, the calm voice on the call. Every clue seemed to contradict another. His parents never gave up, but the weight of uncertainty began to crush them. Annette once said, "Not knowing is the hardest part. If we knew he was gone, we could mourn. But not knowing means you can't stop looking." The police kept the case open. Every new tip was checked. Every new idea followed, but the truth refused to show itself. It became one of those cases that haunted everyone who touched it because nothing about it made sense. The community began to grow restless too. People wanted answers. They wanted to believe in something, an explanation, a theory, anything that could bring peace to the family. But all they had was silence. As time went on, Brandon's story turned into something bigger than a single disappearance. It became a question about how fragile certainty really is, how one ordinary night can turn into a lifetime of questions, how even with technology, maps, and endless searches, sometimes people just vanish. And through it all, the Swansons held on to hope even as they faced the reality that their son might never come home. They believed that somewhere, someone might know something. Maybe a driver passing through that night saw a light, a shadow, a figure walking down a road. Maybe there was one detail, long forgotten, waiting to surface. But until that day came, all they could do was wait. The farmland stayed silent. The wind still moved through the tall grass. And the story of Brandon Swanson remained a mystery, without an ending.
For most people, the story of Brandon Swanson was a mystery, something they read about, something they wondered about, something they couldn't quite explain. But for the Swanson family, it wasn't a mystery. It was there every day. It was the silence at breakfast, the empty chair at the table, the phone that never rang again. It was the ache that lived quietly between two parents who had run out of words to say. After that night, life never went back to normal. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and somehow the world kept moving, even though for Annette and Brian, time had stopped. They went to work. They smiled when people offered kind words, but behind their eyes was a pain that never left. Every sunset reminded them of the night their son walked into the dark and didn't come back. Every sunrise reminded them that he was still out there, somewhere. They became quiet experts in waiting, waiting for updates, waiting for answers, waiting for the day someone would knock on their door and finally tell them what happened. But that day never came. The police did what they could. The community did what they could. But there was only so much ground to search, and so few clues to follow. And as time passed, the energy that once filled every search began to fade. The posters started to wear out. The phone calls became less frequent. But the pain, that stayed the same. Annette once said in an interview, "You wake up every day and think, maybe today we'll know something. And then the day ends, and you don't. And you go to bed still wondering, still hoping, still praying." That's what life became, a cycle of hope and heartbreak that never stopped repeating. Brandon's friends visited often in those first months. They'd sit in his room, talk about him like he might walk in any minute. They shared stories, laughed through tears, trying to keep his memory alive. But eventually, even they stopped coming as much. Not because they forgot, but because it was too hard to keep facing the same silence over and over again. The community didn't forget him, though. Every year, people organized candlelight vigils. They stood in the town square, holding candles, pictures, and hope. Parents held their children closer. Teachers spoke to their students about safety, about calling home, about not walking alone. Brandon's disappearance had changed the town. It had made everyone a little more cautious, a little more aware of how quickly a simple night can turn into something unthinkable. The fear spread quietly. College students began calling their parents more often. People avoided the back roads at night. Friends stayed together after parties. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt it. If it could happen to Brandon, it could happen to anyone. Still, for the Swansons, the fear wasn't what lingered most. It was the emptiness, the not knowing. They learned to live with the weight of a question that never got answered. And that kind of pain doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up in small moments. In the way Annette kept her phone by her bed every night. In the way Brian still looked out the window before locking the door, scanning the road just in case. Holidays were the hardest. Birthdays came and went, each one another reminder of what was missing. They'd bake his favorite cake, not because they expected him to come home, but because it was a way to keep him present, a way to say, "We haven't forgotten." But through all of it, they refused to lose hope. They believed that hope wasn't a weakness, it was survival, because to stop hoping would mean accepting that their son was gone, and that they couldn't do. Annette once described hope as a tiny light that never goes out, even in the darkest night. She said, "You can't see it sometimes, but you feel it. You hold on to it, and it holds you together." The story of Brandon Swanson wasn't just about disappearance anymore. It became about resilience, about how a family can continue breathing when half their heart has gone missing, about how love doesn't end when someone disappears. It waits, it hopes, it carries on. And that, perhaps, is the most human part of this entire mystery.
Out of tragedy, sometimes, something greater begins to grow. When the search for Brandon brought no answers, his parents made a decision. If they couldn't bring their son home, they would make sure no other family ever had to go through what they did. They refused to let the story end with silence. They wanted change. After Brandon disappeared, one thing became painfully clear. The system had failed them. When they first called the police, the response was slow. The officers told them that Brandon was 19, an adult, and that it wasn't unusual for young men to go missing overnight. They were told to wait, to give it time. But those hours of waiting, those hours between life and death, might have been the difference. And that Annette and Brian could never forget. They began speaking out. At town meetings, at press conferences, at every opportunity they got, they shared their story. They spoke about how a family can't wait when someone is missing, how every minute matters, how there should never be hesitation just because someone is over 18. They said, when a person is missing, they're missing. Age shouldn't change that. Their words caught the attention of lawmakers. Local officials began listening. Parents across Minnesota began speaking up, saying, "We'd want the same thing if it were our child." And from that pain, from that persistence, something powerful was born, Brandon's Law. In 2009, just 1 year after he disappeared, Minnesota passed the law in Brandon's name. It required police to begin searching immediately when an adult is reported missing under suspicious or dangerous circumstances, even if they're legally an adult. No waiting, no hesitation, no more lost time. Brandon's Law changed everything. It made sure no other parent would ever hear the words, "He's an adult, give it time." It made sure that when fear sets in, help begins right away. And it stood as proof that even in the darkest stories, something good can still rise from the pain. When Annette spoke at the passing of the law, her voice trembled, but her words were strong. She said, "We can't change what happened to our son, but we can make sure that what happened to him helps someone else." Those words echoed across Minnesota. They still echo today. The story of Brandon Swanson became more than a mystery. It became a message, a reminder that behind every missing person is a family waiting for a phone to ring, a family that never stops searching, a family that still believes in hope. His name became a symbol, not of loss, but of love that refused to fade. Even now, people remember him. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, the town gathers quietly, candles flickering windows, flowers are laid near the riverbank, and for one moment, the air feels still. The community stands together, bound by one unspoken truth, that this could have been any one of them. Brandon's story also reached far beyond Minnesota. Across the country, police departments began reviewing their own policies on missing adults. Other states looked to Minnesota's law as an example. Families of missing people reached out to the Swansons, saying their story gave them strength, gave them a voice. And for Annette and Brian, that was everything. It didn't take away the pain, but it gave it purpose. It turned their grief into movement, their heartbreak into action. In every interview, every vigil, every word they spoke, one thing remained constant: their love for their son. They said, "He was a good kid. He was trying to come home, and that's how we'll always remember him." As the years passed, people continued to ask the same question: what really happened to Brandon Swanson that night? But maybe the answer isn't in the mystery. Maybe it's in what came after, in the law that bears his name, in the families it protects, in the countless lives that might be saved because his story was told. Some mysteries never end. Some questions never find their answers. But even in that silence, there can be meaning, because when a community refuses to forget, when people stand together, when love becomes louder than loss, that's how justice begins. The story of Brandon Swanson doesn't close with an ending. It closes with a promise that his name will never fade, that his story will never be just another unsolved case, that every missing person will be searched for, no matter who they are or how old they may be. Somewhere out there, beneath the same sky he once walked under, the wind still moves through the fields of western Minnesota. The stars still shine over the empty roads, and maybe, just maybe, the echo of his voice still lingers on the night air, steady, calm, guiding, saying, "I'm okay. I can see the lights. I'm almost home." Because sometimes hope doesn't end with answers. Sometimes it ends with light.
When one person disappears, it's never just one life that changes, it's hundreds. Family, friends, classmates, neighbors, even strangers who never met them but suddenly find themselves haunted by the same question: how can someone vanish without a trace? The disappearance of Brandon Swanson became more than a story in a small Minnesota town. It became a mirror, reflecting the fears, the fragility, and the deep connections that tie all of us together. In the weeks that followed, people across the state talked about Brandon's story in hushed tones. In schools, teachers reminded students to call when they got home. Parents stayed up a little longer when their kids were out late. People checked their phones twice before driving down dark country roads. The story had changed something in the air. It made everyone just a little more careful, a little more aware of how quickly a normal night can turn into a mystery. For those who knew Brandon, the pain carried different shades. His friends found it hard to go back to their usual lives. The places they used to hang out now felt heavy, filled with echoes of laughter that belonged to someone who wasn't there anymore. They spoke about him in the present tense, refusing to use the word was. They'd say, "Brandon likes that song," or "He'd love this movie." It was their quiet rebellion against the idea that he was truly gone. At the college he attended, professors placed a small framed picture of him in the hallway, not as a memorial, but as a reminder that even those who walk the most ordinary paths can leave behind an extraordinary impact. Students who never met him would pause in front of that photo, read his name, and feel something they couldn't quite explain, a mix of sadness and connection. Because Brandon wasn't just another missing person. He was one of them, a boy who studied, laughed, dreamed, and believed he'd make it home. The ripple spread beyond Minnesota too. Podcasts, articles, and documentaries began to tell his story. Each one added new listeners, new voices, and new hearts that carried his name forward. And each time someone heard it, they felt the same thing: disbelief, sorrow, and an ache to understand. Because it wasn't just about how Brandon disappeared. It was about how his parents kept standing, how they turned grief into purpose, and how love refused to fade even when the world gave them no answers. In that way, Brandon's story became something sacred, a lesson in endurance, a lesson in how loss doesn't always look like an ending. Sometimes it looks like two people choosing to keep hope alive every single day, even when the world tells them to let it go. Annette once said in a television interview, "There are moments when it hits you again. The smell of rain, a song on the radio, the sound of gravel under tires, and suddenly you're back there, back to that night, back to the moment everything changed." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. You don't move on from something like this. You move forward with it. Those words reached people far beyond Minnesota. Families who had lost someone, missing children, missing siblings, missing friends, found strength in her voice. They began writing letters to the Swansons, hundreds of them, saying thank you. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you for showing us that hope can live even when answers don't exist. The community of Marshall changed in quiet ways. Local businesses sponsored awareness programs. Law enforcement began new training for missing person cases. Volunteers who once searched for Brandon became lifelong advocates for other missing families. His name sparked movements, his story sparked empathy, and his legacy sparked action. And still, his parents continued to visit that same stretch of road every year. They'd park their car near the ditch where his Chevy was found. They'd walk a few steps into the field, close their eyes, and listen to the wind. Annette would whisper, "We're still looking, Brandon. We're still here." And for a moment, the world would feel small again. Just a mother, a father, and a son whose voice still echoed somewhere in the night. Sometimes, Brian would look up at the stars and he'd think about the phone call. 47 minutes. He'd think about every word, every pause, every laugh. And he'd imagine what his son might have seen that night. The endless fields, the lights in the distance, the feeling of being almost home. He said once, "I like to think he wasn't scared. I like to think he kept walking, still believing we'd find him." Those words carry something larger than grief. They carry faith, not in miracles, but in love. The kind of love that keeps people searching when the world stops caring. The kind of love that turns pain into purpose. Over the years, Brandon's case has remained open. Every now and then, new tips come in. A farmer finds something unusual in a field. A hiker spots something near the river. Each time, investigators go, hoping for the moment that will finally bring closure. But so far, the mystery remains untouched, frozen in time. And yet, somehow, his story keeps moving. Through every person who hears it, through every family that learns from it, through every parent who calls their child just to say, "Text me when you get home." The disappearance of Brandon Swanson is not just a tragedy. It's a reflection of how fragile life can be, how one wrong turn, one dark night, one missed road can change everything. But it's also a reminder of how far love can reach, how long hope can last, and how deep a family's promise can go. Because the Swansons made a promise that as long as they're alive, their son's name will never be forgotten. That they will keep searching, keep speaking, keep fighting, not just for him, but for every person who's ever vanished into silence. And that's what the world remembers now. Not just the night of fear, not just a mystery unsolved, but a story of two parents, standing under the same sky their son once walked beneath, holding on to hope and whispering into the wind. We still see your light, Brandon.
It's been years since that night. Years since the sound of gravel under footsteps faded into silence. Years since the last word of that 47-minute call. But even now, in the small towns of Minnesota, the story of Brandon Swanson still drifts through the air like a quiet echo. It's whispered in classrooms, spoken softly in homes, remembered in moments when people look out into the dark and feel that same chill of wondering, how can someone simply disappear? For Annette and Brian, the ache never really left. Grief became a quiet companion, always there, sitting in the corners of their house, walking with them through every season. Yet even in their sorrow, they built something that lasts. They built a legacy of compassion, awareness, and change. They turned their pain into protection for others. They gave their son's story meaning. And that, in its own way, is a kind of peace. Every year, on the anniversary of Brandon's disappearance, a vigil is held. People come with candles in hand, standing in silence as the wind moves softly across the open fields. The same stars that watched over Brandon that night still shine overhead. In the distance, the lights of Lynd flicker faintly, the same lights he thought he saw on that final walk. And as the candles glow, people bow their heads. Some pray, some cry quietly, and others just stand still, remembering. What makes this story unforgettable isn't just the mystery, it's the humanity. It's a mother who never stopped calling her son's name, a father who still drives the same roads, still scanning the horizon, hoping to see something, anything. It's the friends who keep his photo in their wallets, the neighbors who still check ditches after heavy rain. It's the town that learned how to hold on to hope, even when the world gives no answers. Brandon's law changed the way police respond to missing adults, but his story changed something deeper, the way people care for one another. In every search that happens now, in every emergency that begins with the words, "Someone's missing," there's a piece of his story guiding the way. A reminder that time matters, that every minute counts, and that sometimes one phone call can mean everything. Across the country, people who have never been to Minnesota, who have never met the Swansons, still remember his name. They hear his story and feel the same pull, the mix of sadness, fear, and strange connection. Because deep down, everyone knows this could have been their family, their child, their voice fading into the dark. Brandon's disappearance reminds us how fragile life is, but also how strong love can be when tested by silence. When you look at the photos of Brandon, his smile, his glasses, that easy confidence, it's hard to imagine how a life like that could end in mystery. And maybe that's the point. Maybe his story isn't meant to end at all. Maybe it's meant to keep moving, from one heart to another, reminding us to care more deeply, to act more quickly, to never take a moment of connection for granted. Somewhere tonight, another parent is waiting for a call that hasn't come. Another family is pacing their living room, praying, hoping, holding on. And maybe they've heard Brandon's story. Maybe they've learned from it. Maybe that story will help them find their own ending. And if it does, then his voice, the voice that fell silent all those years ago, will have finally spoken again through them. This is what true crime unforgettable really means. Not the horror, not the mystery, but the memory, the people who never let go, the love that never fades,
the community that refuses to stop caring. Because when we remember, when we speak their names, they are not gone. So tonight, if you're listening, take a moment. Look out your window. See the sky, the stars, the quiet roads. Think of a boy named Brandon Swanson, 19 years old, walking alone under that same sky, believing he was almost home. Think of his parents, who turned heartbreak into hope. Think of the law that carries his name and the lives it's already saved. And remember this: someone, somewhere, always knows something. Sometimes it's a memory. Sometimes it's a clue. Sometimes it's a moment that doesn't make sense until years later. But when people speak up, when people share, when people care, silence breaks. So share his story. Tell it, pass it on. Because stories like this don't belong to one family anymore. They belong to all of us. They remind us of who we are and who we could be if we just choose to listen. The final words belong to hope. The same hope that guided a young man through the darkness, and the same hope that still lights the way for those searching for him today. Hope that someday the truth will be found. Hope that one unanswered call will finally be answered. Hope that love, even in its quietest form, will reach where the roads end. Because a community united is impossible to ignore. And together, we seek justice, we seek closure, and above all, we keep the light alive. Share this story, because someone, somewhere, still needs to hear it.